Good afternoon. I'm Ibrahim Adrame, Director of Education at the Henry George School, and welcome to the school for our special panel on housing in New York, what it takes to tackle the affordability crisis. So before I hand it over to our distinguished speakers, I'd like to just give a few highlights on the situation here in New York. We know that more than 1/3 of New Yorkers spend half of their income on rent. And we also happen to have the second largest homeless population in the country. I think we are just behind California. So in the past few years, public policy has mainly concentrated on easing access to home ownership, mainly through demand-side policies. But at the same time, supply has lagged, and this phenomenon has resulted into upward pressure on prices, making it more affordable to own a home or to pay rent. So, but I would say, fortunately, a new narrative seems to be inspiring public policy today. That is, we have a supply shortage, and the only way we should address it is to build more. And both the mayor and I learned today, the governor also, have outlined ambitious plans to substantially increase the number of units. The idea here is if you add more units, you will meet demand at the price point that most New Yorkers would be able to afford. Now, the question is, does these policies and other proposals being considered hold the key to addressing the problem? Or is it time to start thinking outside of the box of mainstream economics? So joining us to discuss this, we have Hannah Anouche, Community Land Trust Coordinator at Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, Dr. James DeFilippis, Professor of Economics at Rutgers University, Haley Kim, former coordinator at the Mink-Wan Center, and last but not least, our own Dr. Marty Rowland, Senior Fellow at the Asset Leadership Network. Marty is also a trustee at the Henry George School. So without any delay, the floor is yours. I think, James, we're going to start with you, and then the others will take over. Thank you.
Hi, one quick clarification. I'm not in the econ department. I'm in the School of Planning and Policy. I'm a professor of urban planning and public policy rather than economics. We can have a whole conversation about the usefulness of economics for this. But I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of alternative narratives that have emerged beyond the kind of very simple supply sort of explanation. And those narratives are rooted in the fact that and those explanations for the price increases that we have that we've seen are rooted in the fact that so much of what happens in land development and land more broadly is about speculative investment capital making housing inaffordable for large numbers of people. And you started with, the stats that we all know and the experience that we all have as New Yorkers. But it's not just a New York story. And one of the ways, and the ways that I have always thought about addressing housing affordability, and one of the reasons why I was interested in being part of a conversation at the Henry George School is through the decommodification of land, rather than just sort of give the developers whatever they want. And that hope that prices come down. You're never going to get in a hot housing market, you're never going to get to deeply affordable without very substantial subsidies. And the very kind of simplistic supply side explanation that seems to have taken hold fails to take that into account. It's also remarkable to me, right? Like, given that, you don't have to be that old to remember the period leading to the foreclosure crisis being a period of incredibly hyper price appreciation in real property markets all over the planet, having nothing to do with local supply constraints. And you don't have to do anything except look at what's going on in the world in real property markets for the last half decade and particularly for the last few years up until 2022, to see price appreciation, everywhere. And, and quite frankly, American price appreciation in housing, it's much less than it has been in places like, Sweden or New Zealand or many other countries. And there's no way land use restrictions in the Bay Area explain rapid price appreciation in Stockholm or Christchurch, New Zealand. So very clearly there are other things going on. And what's going on and what has been going on is very large amounts of speculative investment capital sort of pouring into real property. And so then the way to respond to that is to rethink land in urban political economies. And I've been part of the community land trust movement since the very late 1990s, when I first started getting involved in various efforts for forms of community control in their economies more broadly. And I do this both sort of like locally as a New Yorker, as a Queens kid, even if I live in Brooklyn now, but also sort of I'll put my academic hat on and be a researcher. There's been an explosive growth of CLTs in the last 20 years. We're now at about 300 community land trusts in the United States. There are other forms of what people are calling shared equity housing that have also, similarly grown. ROCs, which are less of an issue in New York City, but very much an issue in many other metropolitan areas, which are resident-owned communities in manufactured housing communities where the people in their homes sort of pool their money and get a friendly loan from an entity called ROC USA to buy the land underneath them and take it out of the market and own it as a cooperative. And then, of course, limited equity cooperatives, which we've been doing in New York, for basically a century now, but have taken off fairly recently, and particularly in DC in the last 2 decades, because they finally put money into DC's TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And so you're seeing cooperatives form from buildings that had been owned by a landlord or an investor. And there's a lot of variation in this stuff around the country. And it's very hard to say what a CLT is by itself. And the central part of that is because CLTs are fairly promiscuous forms. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that sort of in the best possible way, and that they can be used for any number of different things. What they are about is taking the land out of the market and giving the community the control over what happens on that land. And the trust part, the last part of the CLT is that that land is decommodified in perpetuity, and the community control remains in perpetuity. In New York, we've had a bunch of organizing efforts around this. In 2012, Picture the Homeless brought together a bunch of organizers and academic supporters, myself included, to form the New York City Community Land Initiative. At the time, we had 1 CLT operating in New York City. We currently have 17, I think. Is that, there may be 1 or 2 more that I'm missing, Hannah? You can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Right. I think we're adding more. I think we've added 2 new CLTs in the last couple of months.
Oh, great. I mean, yeah, I was sort of told. Anyway, there's been very rapid growth, and it's easy for those of us involved to lose track sometimes. We've gotten some policy wins from the city council in terms of technical assistance and staffing support, but what we don't have is land or capital, both of which are really central to it, to the form. There are a set of bills that I would very strongly encourage people involved with the Henry George School to support, bundled together under the Community Land Act. And I don't know, Hannah, you were going to talk about it. If you are, then I won't say anything more about it. But that are essentially around sort of site access, whether it be kind of public land or the ability to purchase privately owned land. I want to end, my very sort of brief opening comments by reiterating again that you cannot get to deep affordability without subsidies, because math is on the test. You can internally cross-subsidize within developments, and New York has a robust enough rental market to do so. But even so, it's hard to get to 30 or 40% without some public money involved, and without sort of having the bulk of the development work be at market rate, well beyond what is affordable to working class and poor communities. And I'll end with that. There's a lot more I could say about sort of some of the other drivers of the rapid price appreciation that we're having. But I will turn it over to the other panelists, and I don't want to take too much time.
Anna, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. James really set me up well, I have to say. I'm Hannah Anouche, she, her pronouns, and I'm the staff person for the East New York Community Land Trust. This Community Land Trust was incubated by Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, which is a settlement house and affordable housing developer in East New York and Brooklyn. So just a little bit about us. So the East New York CLT was founded in March 2020, like right after the COVID outbreak in New York City. Longtime East New York and Brownsville residents got together to form the East New York CLT because they were scared that COVID would exacerbate two trends that they were seeing. The first trend is the city selling off public land and buildings to private developers for as little as $1. And then the second trend, the speculative purchasing of and flipping of vacant lots, small homes, and larger multifamily buildings throughout the neighborhood. In 2016, under de Blasio, East New York was rezoned. It was the first neighborhood-wide rezoning under Mayor de Blasio. And so we've been seeing the impacts of that, largely investors coming in. So since forming, we've surveyed all 255 city-owned vacant lots across East New York. We would go out every Saturday in teams and survey these lots. And from there, we narrowed down the list to 10 lots that we really believe are viable for CLT acquisition and development based on the lot size and the zoning and other factors, environmental factors. And what we've done since then is survey residents and organize town halls and visioning sessions to find out what residents who live near these sites actually want to see on the land. Really, our whole mission is that development and planning should be for longtime low-income residents and done by longtime low-income residents. So after doing these visioning sessions and surveys, we hired an architect to help put these visions on paper. And we partnered with Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation to actually develop on this land. And right now we're really pushing the city to transfer these sites to the CLT so we can implement their vision. So in addition to that, we're also, as James mentioned, we're part of this citywide coalition of CLTs called Nicely. And through that coalition, we're pushing for legislation that is going to really support social housing. It's going to really support the CLT movement in New York City and give communities control of land. The first is the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which will give CLTs and other mission-driven nonprofits the first right to purchase multifamily buildings when their owner puts them up for sale. So before they go in the open market, CLTs and other nonprofits will have the first right to put in an offer. And this is modeled off of this legislation in other places like DC and San Francisco. We're also pushing for the public land for public good bill, which will mean that when the city transfers city-owned land, it has to prioritize CLTs and other nonprofits. We don't want to see more of this fire sale of public land to for-profit developers who are not accountable, and often when their regulatory agreements expire, they will raise the rents. We also are fighting to abolish and replace the New York City tax lien sale. The tax lien sale is this privatized system of debt collection that was first instituted in 1996 under Mayor Giuliani. And what it does is, if you are a property owner of any type, you have a vacant lot, you have a home, you have a building. Once your debt reaches a certain threshold, for a homeowner that's like $2,000 to $3,000, the city then sells your debt as a lien to a third party investment trust run by the Bank of New York Mellon. And this trust can then go after you for the money that's owed and can eventually foreclose. The real issue with that is that this trust is not accountable to the people. We may feel that the government could be more accountable, but they are way more accountable than this privatized trust. And so in situations where, you have like a multifamily building owner, like a slumlord that's not paying their debt, you're giving away the right for the city to foreclose. Now this third-party trust can foreclose. And that's a real issue because basically we're privatizing land and buildings through the system. And so we've developed a replacement system that would return these land and buildings to the public domain, and could actually create a real pipeline for CLTs. So that's a lot. I'll stop there. I was asked to talk about like what the challenges are. Like I said, we've identified a lot of public land that's vacant still. And the city is also privatizing land as we speak. So I think that, while land is scarce, that's not the obstacle that we think it is. But funding really is. We really, really need funding to support alternative models like community land trusts.
Fantastic. Thanks. Haley?
Everyone, I'm Haley Kim. I'm formerly with the Minkwon Center for Community Action. I used to be their housing organizer, and I will be talking about real estate developments, private real estate development, and how it affects everything that we're talking about. So one of the things that I find useful to frame the way that real estate developers have kind of like gotten their claws, especially here in Queens, is they cause high rents by building mega developments, and then there's very little bits of affordable housing added in. The rents go up, people are displaced, and now people see real estate developers as being still the kind of people who are going to save them from more displacement by building those like small amounts of affordable housing. And it speaks to the larger privatization of basically human rights that we should all be having. And a few things that I think might be good examples of also why people have bought into this framework are the Flushing waterfront rezoning, and the Innovation Queens rezoning that just happened, and the Willets Point rezoning that is also about to happen. So with the Flushing waterfront rezoning, one of the big things that people talked about was jobs. Oh, you're going to block X amount of jobs, which again, why are we depending on private real estate developers to provide jobs to the community? It should be stuff that the city provides. It should be things that that we actually are building administrative capacity to build ourselves. But no, we're outsourcing it again and privatizing it by giving this job to giant wealthy real estate developers. And again, with Innovation Queens, that was another fight. This time the developers gave a lot more affordable housing than they did for the Flushing waterfront rezoning. Same thing with Willets Point, more affordable housing units. But the kind of like thing that they're actually arguing for now is that because these projects are going to be so expensive, they need the 421A tax breaks to be able to pay for it. And now the future of the Innovation Queens project is now uncertain because of that. And again, all these things are being privatized. Why are we depending on private real estate developers who caused the problem to begin with to come in and save us from the problem that they caused? And there are other solutions that we have other than big real estate developers. There's currently 30,000 or more rent stabilized units that are being withheld by landlords throughout the city. Why are we not actually doing something about that to open up actual affordable housing that we don't have to spend billions of dollars on or give billions of dollars of tax breaks to real estate developers to create? These already exist. And of course, CLTs and social housing are other solutions that we can utilize other than private real estate developers. And we do have to understand that we are in the middle of a housing crisis. Ibrahima mentioned that 1 in 2, basically half of all New Yorkers are rent burdened. How are we going to solve it? And how are we going to solve it without being more and more indebted to big real estate? And that's the question I want to leave off with.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahdi. I think you are muted, Mahdi.
Thank you, Abraham, and thank you for the other panelists. It was a great introduction. I particularly like things that Haley had to say, because one of the reasons we're holding this event in mid-December is that there's always this threat that the tax exemptions that or abatements that were granted to developers might be reinstituted. And now we hear from Haley that there's ongoing projects in Flushing that require the 421A abatement, for example, to be put in place. So that generates a lot of political pressure for the legislature, and their legislature, I would imagine, are eager to find those examples for why they need to bring that back. So I thought I'd cover that in a second. I just want to give a little introduction to the Henry George School of Social Science, because what we've just heard from the first 3 panelists is a description of the idea of a community land trust, which really is an example of the Henry George solution to poverty. And how that happens is that it takes the land out of the the capitalization of future rents, and that's what reason why property values go up, and why housing costs so much. So if you don't have to pay a mortgage that's based on some inflated value that doesn't need to go up, then you're in a better situation. But Henry George, way back in 1879, wrote a book on progress and poverty, and essentially says that the solution to the problem of poverty is the not having land be subject to private ownership. And that might sound kind of radical, but if you think about properties that are owned today, and what people feel is a full free market enterprise, you still have the the opportunity by government to seize land if you don't pay a tax. So in reality, what Henry George was talking about was really not that far-fetched or radical or communistic. It's really kind of like the way things work. So CLTs, as I explained, conforms to that idea. One of the things that a policy recommendation that Henry George School of Social Science should be preaching at every opportunity is to revisit the policy that Al Smith, governor of New York, proposed and actually implemented in the 1920s, which was to remove the buildings on the property tax. So essentially, by doing that, he made property taxes all based on land value, which is the solution that Henry George came up with, the land value tax. And I'm not sure how many people know the history, but that was before the Depression, and New York City saw a boom in buildings because of that, and kind of weathered the coming Depression. So that was really a good thing that we can add to some of the solutions. But one of the things that we can't allow, and for the reasons I'm going to say in a minute, we can't allow these 421A and the J51 tax abatements to continue. We're losing approximately $4 billion every year on these abatements. And I think the philosophy behind that is that there's a common belief that if we can all beat this tax monster with a stick, we all win. But the reality is, if somebody is getting an abatement, it means that the rest of us are having to pay up their portion, that it's really their obligation. So there are people paying for their tax. So one of the things that we found in some research that we did in the school was that vacant office buildings are undertaxed. They're vacant, they're not generating revenue, they're not hiring anybody, but they're not paying a very high property tax year to year. So it makes a lot of sense to convert some of these office buildings into community land trusts or other types of operations to fill that gap. And perhaps the way to do that would be to implement the appropriate tax for a vacant building, and that might induce them to work some kind of solution with a community land trust. So that is kind of like an overview of what I had to say in terms of the Henry George approach. I do think that we need to have more community land trusts as the the default to, well, how are we going to get there? Because Mayor Adams talks about 500,000 more affordable. Well, I don't know if he talked about affordable, but 500,000 more units of housing, and I think we need to push on him to make them all affordable. And I think we've just discussed the reasons why. So I think I'll stop it there and maybe turn it back to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Marty. Thank you for thank you to all our panelists. I just happen to have a quick question that I wanted to ask. I think most of the conversation turned around the idea of CLTs, which looks like a viable solution because it was tried in many places, not just in this country, and it has great merits. I think there is no question about that. But it takes time and it's a long process. So I'm wondering if in the meantime, there is any stopgap measure that could be considered. Like, for example, I see James mentioned that we have 103,000 units that are sitting vacant most of the time. So there is a phenomenon known in the city called warehousing, where you just artificially dry up the supply so that prices could go up. So I'm thinking maybe a vacancy tax could be just like a temporary measure until we have more CLTs in place. What do you think? Yeah, James, go ahead.
Oh, I think we absolutely, this is, to Haley's point as well, right? That we absolutely need a vacancy tax. One of the first things that the Picture the Homeless was fighting for when we got together in 2012 was for a really detailed kind of accounting of all the vacant units. Some that we could just, we could just squat, right? Like, I don't know why squatting is a thing that is not sort of talked through much anymore. But for sure, and I'm going to dump in the chat the housing vacancy survey data that was released for the 2021 housing vacancy survey. The data that was released in May or June, in May, by HPD. It's kind of wild. We're at 353,000 units in New York, in the 5 boroughs, that are, quote, vacant but not available for sale or rent, right? So we've got 9.5% of our housing stock is completely taken off the market. That's crazy fast. But I'll stop. But yes, we could, and how vacancy is measured, right? Like that becomes a really complicated question for some of them, but not for all of them, right? Like I think, there are ways to kind of, is this your primary residence, right? With the second homes. If it's not, then we tax it at the what's the going rent for a unit of that size in the 5 boroughs, and that's what your tax is, right? Keep it nice and simple.
Yeah. So before I hand it open to the audience, I happen to have another question. That is, we also know that one of the driving factors of price rises is foreign investors coming in and buying land in New York. Like I kind of think sometimes that New York City land is a second reserve currency near the dollar. So would you think it's a sensible policy move to make sure foreigners are not allowed to buy land here? Because that's exactly what New Zealand did when they realized that big guys are coming and buying all the land and it wasn't becoming affordable to locals. Did you consider that, or would you think it's a good policy move? It would be.
Well, I guess I could take that. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea for billionaires to buy units. And
I'm talking of foreign billionaires, not locals.
I'm sorry?
Foreigners, foreign billionaires.
So I don't have a problem with foreign billionaires, but I do have a problem with foreign and even local billionaires to get the tax abatement. And like what I was saying, that there's $4 billion every year that we're losing, and if it's not stopped, we'll have another 421A and we'll continue that bleeding. So it's really a matter of are they paying their way? And I agree that New York real estate probably is a reserve currency because they're obviously parking their money here. And what are we getting out of it? The fabric of New York City is changing, sometimes by mom and pops that have been here for hundreds of years, and I think in Chinatown as well, where people are selling out, and then you get another high rise, and nobody's living in them. So I really think that James hit it on the head with the vacancy tax, something that Vancouver's had a lot of success with. So that's my ideas.
Fantastic. Any other comments from our panelists before we open it to the audience? If not, let's go.
Well, I just want to jump in. Sorry. I both my parents are immigrants, and I grew up in Flushing, in the heart of sort of immigrant Queens, and I'm less concerned about where a person sort of is from, and more concerned about what they're doing with the land. And I would not want to treat people differently on sort of minute zero based on sort of where they happen to be from. It just sort of it kind of just strikes me as sort of a not great place to start from. And I would much more center around the actions rather than the person.
Mhm. Good point. Ed Dodson has a comment here. He said, back in my years at Fannie Mae, I worked to improve the success of getting banks to provide mortgage financing to purchases of homes in CLTs. I'm happy to discuss some of the issues and solution. Is an interesting time to do so. Yeah, definitely, Ed. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, I've opened my microphone and my camera. So I retired in 2005. So some of what I might have to say is a little dated, but we had a partnership office in New York City and worked on many initiatives to increase the supply of affordable housing in New York, including trying to help promote the establishment of community land trusts. But as your speakers have indicated, the success in doing so was non-existent. There just wasn't any interest. But initially, for a long time, the city had a great deal of land in inventory and made that land available for nonprofit development. And so we were able to get funding to put up quite a few housing units. The problem was New York's program at the time provided what was called a soft second mortgage to people who purchased and renovated properties. And for example, in Harlem, there were many brownstones that had been abandoned for a long time. They were, with financing that we raised, renovated with conditions that, let's say, if it was a 4-unit property, the 1 unit would be owner occupied, and the other 3 units would be leased to income qualified tenants. But each year, I think for 10-year period, if I'm not mistaken, a portion of that second mortgage obligation was eliminated. And so at the end of 10 years, that property became market rate, and the restrictions on the tenant on the use of, on the lease of the tenant occupied units may or may not have gone away. I don't remember. But the one, and out of all of that, my comment is to say, New York's housing problem is multifaceted. And as James indicated, New York neighborhoods have been fluid. So a neighborhood for a couple of generations may have been occupied by Jewish people, followed by Polish people, followed by Puerto Rican people, followed by Dominican Republic people. So New York has one of the most fluid populations of any city in the United States. The other dynamic that I think is now affecting New York in the same way it's affecting many other cities is the return of empty nesters from their suburban housing into the city to take advantage of the city's amenities. And they come with high incomes, and that drives up the price of both rental and ownership housing. So as Marty was indicating, the real solution is the solution proposed by Henry George, and that is to eliminate the taxation of residential property altogether, except for the land, and to begin to collect the public revenue from land values. That is a position I took at Fannie Mae. It's a position I promoted with our senior people there. And a few years before I was ready to retire, they sent me out on the road to sell this story to cities. And unfortunately, when I retired, there was no one else to take my position. So the one idea that I left Fannie Mae with that might be valuable for New York City is I designed a program to incorporate community land trusts on a scattered site basis, so that it would not be required to aggregate contiguous parcels into huge sites, that you could actually bring individual pieces of land or individual houses into the community land trust. And then the next question that I attempted to address is whether or not those properties should remain in the trust in perpetuity, or give the property owner, the homeowner, the opportunity to sell, and then whatever gains that property would achieve, which would be land value gains, would belong to the trust, which could then be used to provide assistance for the purchase of a property to the next buyer. So I have that paper. I'm willing to share it with you if you like. I can send it to Ibrahima and he can distribute it, but I'll respond to any questions that you have of me, either now or in the future.
Great, thanks. Looks like there is interest for the paper. Any questions on Ed's interesting comments?
Well, this is Marty. I would like to ask if, so you're saying that that's the current policy at Fannie Mae that.
Oh, no, Marty, I mean, as you know, or probably know, Fannie Mae was taken over by the government in 2007. So as I often say, I was one of the last people to retire with the retirement party. Everyone else in our division got packages. So, you know, what Fannie Mae's efforts are on affordable housing these days are largely determined by the Treasury Department. So I don't know what the status is of any of their policies with regard to lending in community land trust. The issue that we used to have was foreclosure, and that is when a property went into a community land trust and the homeowner for some reason got into financial problems and couldn't pay their mortgage debt, would the community land trust release the land parcel during a foreclosure proceeding? And that was always very difficult. So the solution tended to be to give the land trust the right of first refusal to pay off the first mortgage debt. And so that would depend upon whether the land trust had access to financial capital.
Yeah, that sounds something like what Hannah was talking about. So good, thanks.
You're welcome.
Any questions or comments?
I did want to just jump in and point out that during the foreclosure crisis, when things were really bad and foreclosures were incredibly widespread, land, homes on CLT lands outperformed the prime market in terms of rates of foreclosure, because some of that was because those were almost entirely portfolio products that the banks held on their books, so they could kind of reach a deal, rather than go through foreclosure. But once the loan was sold in the secondary market, as it was so often for so many mortgage loans, that becomes exceedingly difficult to do. But it was a little bit like old-fashioned banking. Now that there's more of a secondary market for CLT loans, I do worry that if we go into a kind of a massive foreclosure crisis, that they might not perform quite as well. But CLTs as stewards also are there to kind of, homeowners know that the CLT is there. If they get into trouble early on, right? Like, it's not sort of like foreclosure is not like a light switch where everything is great and then all of a sudden you turn the lights off and then it's sort of done, right? Like, it's sort of a process of getting you to that point. And if you, find ways to intervene early on, you can sort of, shift the trajectory.
Yeah. I would just add one thought, and that is what New York City also needs, as do many cities, is a public bank. So I would be in consultation with Ellen Brown and those folks who support public banking to get a public bank approved for New York City.
Yeah, just to say, so East New York CLT and many other CLTs in the city are members of the Public Bank Coalition. And so we are fighting really hard to get a public bank in New York City. We're primarily fighting for state legislation that will enable a city public bank. But we also have a couple bills that will help pave the way for city bills that will help pave the way for a public bank.
Great. Another question that I have is how much of a contributing factor is to the housing crisis? I mean, the corporate landlords, because it's becoming a growing trend lately, especially after the 2008 financial and housing crisis. Many of the houses that were unable to be sold or that were foreclosed ended up being gobbled up by Wall Street backed banking, how do I call it? Corporate landlords. I think BlackRock is one of them, and they are present all over the world because there is a pushback in Europe as well. So how much of that is a contributing factor to the problem that we are facing?
I'll give you one quick statistics. It's 1 out of 4 housing sales is going to the corporate sector.
Wow, it's big.
Well, this is Marty. It sounds like the blob that ate the world, and I think we need to control that in some fashion, like make legislators aware of the fact, and like what Hannah was talking about, to work the legislature to stop things that are clearly against the interest of their constituents. Like, why is New York City like subject to this invasion? What do we get out of it? We get higher prices. So I just don't get the argument. Like, it might be something where we require corporate landlords to appear in a public forum and say, this is what we're doing today, so they can get the tomatoes thrown at them.
Right.
I just dumped into the chat a report that our friends at Chaya, a really excellent group in Jackson Heights, I'm sure Hallie knows very well and has worked very closely with, because they collaborate with Min Kwan, as far as I understand. This is a report that they did in 2019 on sort of private equity investors buying up homes in Central and Western Queens, in Jackson Heights, in Woodside and Sunnyside, and in Richmond Hill as well, where Chaya is actively organizing. This is before the pandemic, and we were looking at 20 to 40% of new home sales in any given year in the post-Great Recession that were being bought out by private equity capital. They're basically sort of a systematic way to kind of strip the ability to accumulate wealth in working class immigrant neighborhoods, right? If you look at who's in Jackson Heights, who's in Woodside, who's in Sunnyside, except for the Gardens, which is this weird other thing. It's all working class immigrants, and it's incredibly devastating. To the ability to kind of not just accumulate wealth, but also control your own space, right? Which is sort of massively important, I think, and undervalued.
Interesting. So you would think the idea of decommodifying the land, as you mentioned in your preliminary intro, would be a good response to that, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, well, certainly. Then the whole purpose of private equity going into it would be sort of removed at that point. Because they are, in the old sort of Henry George kind of language, right? Like they're about sort of accumulating the unearned increment, right? Like that's essentially what they're doing. If I remember my Henry George.
That's correct. Joe Polito. You are muted, Joe. Okay.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
A few questions. One, does New York advocate inclusionary zoning? What changes would you make to the rent control rules? Is there a move to I'm assuming in the United States that real estate transactions, commercial real estate transactions, qualify for capital gains exemptions or favorable treatment of capital gains. are these areas that you folks are looking at to try to also get at capturing this unearned income? Thank you.
Who's gonna go for that? James, you wanna give it a try? No.
I think given the very real sort of rezoning fights that have happened in East New York and in West Flushing, that Hannah and Haley are far better positioned than I am.
Okay.
I guess with inclusionary zoning, I can try to address that. I mean, I think like mandatory inclusionary housing has been a tool that's been misused. You know, it's really best used in high income neighborhoods where the market rate rents can really subsidize the affordable rents. It really is not a tool that should be used in many of the outer borough neighborhoods, East New York, the Bronx, in Flushing, in Astoria. I don't personally support it being used there. Also, I mean, I don't like that sort of like this incentive, you know, you get to build higher if you include affordable housing. Should just be a requirement. Personally, that's my personal opinion.
Hannah, if I can interject here, we had a city planner write about it, inclusionary zoning in the newspaper, and he said, ultimately, like development charges, and I guess I should have asked about that as well, they help to push down the price of land, because when the developer sees that some of that economic rent is going to be passed on to the city, then they are willing to pay less for the properties that they're purchasing to develop on. In fact, the Henry George School had a presentation by Professor Patrick Condon, who talked about 100% inclusionary zone. And you know, I mean, the developer looks at how much is the land, how much can I sell it for, right? And if you keep capturing this economic rent, that will push down the price of the land. And that's how the city planner described inclusionary zoning and helped to sell some of it to the city councilors.
Thanks. Michael?
Hello, I'm not a New Yorker, I'm a Londoner, and I live in London. And I'd just like to raise a couple of points. There's a lot of the conversations centers around subsidy. And I just like, in England, we have private home ownership and you can privately rent. You also have council housing, which tends to be owned by the community and has got funds, and it tends to be cheaper. Then you have housing associations, which also tend to be cheaper as well, because they're subsidized by a sort of land initiative, really. They own thousands and thousands of houses in London, these housing associations, so they tend to be cheaper. But one aspect of them all is they do have to be affordable by those who have, when they set the rents for these places, they do have to be affordable by the people who want to rent them. So there is that parameter. Now, if they can't afford them, and even the low rents, then they have to be subsidized from another source. Now, I think that you still have, just a point I think that's come out in my mind anyway, you still have to be able to afford. Now, I live in the outskirts of London, in Peckham, and it's still very expensive, but I couldn't live in central London because I couldn't afford, and so I don't even consider it. So what is affordable? And if you can't afford anything, then where do you go? You have to be subsidized by someone else. Mum and dad, if you're a young person, or you have, some, someone looks after you. A lot of people here are going back to their family homes because they can't get on the housing ladder. A great desire to be on the housing ladder because of the advantages. You can trade up and move wherever you like. But if you live in a council house or a housing association, it's not, you can't move to another place that has the same subsidies. So it's the idea of subsidy, I think, it is a question that should be addressed. And I don't know what it's like in New York, but if you can't afford it, you can't live there, and unless you can get the do-re-mi, as they say.
Thank you, Michael. Ed.
I have a question to our panelists about the efficacy of the New York Housing Trust Fund and whether or not efforts have been made to try to get an allocation from that fund to be used for the acquisition of land by CLTs. Is that a provision in the trust fund? And the second part of that question is, I don't remember, it's been years, but are the funds raised by a special surtax on the value of real estate transactions?
Any volunteer for that question? Technical.
Well, if you don't have the answers
Yeah.
to the questions, I think that they're important. It's an important issue to be researched to see what the potential might be to either get support at the state level for revision of that law, or to make use of the law as it currently exists. I mean, the same argument I would make about the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, HMDA, and whether or not it's possible to get some legislation introduced at the national level to accomplish the same sort of thing, to get funds allocated to CLTs across the nation.
Yeah, that's good. So
Right.
it's historic land trust, you said?
No, it's a housing trust fund. Yeah, that, I mean, my understanding about the housing trust fund out of Albany is that we only get like about 25 million a year, statewide, which is not nothing, but it's not, given the scale of things, sort of like that's not going to go that far. There's a statewide coalition of CLTs that is being organized by Cottrell. Oh God, Hannah, what's Cottrell's last name?
Cottrell Lewis with Habitat.
Cottrell Lewis at Habitat, yeah. And there are a set of state policy sort of priorities, but we don't. I've never heard anybody sort of center the Housing Trust Fund as one to kind of. The problem, right, is that if you say no, give it to us, what you're essentially saying is don't give it to other nonprofit housing providers, and there are enough other kind of political agenda items that don't require us to fight with our friends, that there's been less of an initiative to kind of say redirect LIHTC points as well, right, would be the other one, to have, when the state HFA sort of allocates points, to have a CLT or LIHTC being done on land owned by a CLT. Like, we don't want to have that fight just yet.
Not that it wouldn't be a fight, but there are some examples where cooperatives have been successfully developed on CLT land. And so I think that's the perfect marriage. And so what it would take in New York State and Albany to get state legislation or amendments to existing legislation, I don't know, but I think it would be a worthwhile endeavor.
Definitely a good idea. Thanks.
Thanks. Any questions?
Well, Ibrahim, I would like to see if Haley Kim could give us more information about the casino that was proposed in Willets Point. Is that an active program? Is the developer looking for 421A abatements for that site?
I think the Willets Point redistricting, I could be completely incorrect, but the way that I understand it is I think they're using the affordable housing units attached to the soccer stadium that they're building as an excuse to build the casino and get a sweetheart deal for that.
Interesting. Joe wants to come back. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up on the developmental charges thing. Is that a practice you advocate? We've done a fair amount of that here, and the idea again is to capture some of the economic rent the developer is passing it on to the city. Thank you.
So you're talking about charges that that the developer would do certain things that the city wants in lieu of taxes or something?
No, let's say they're putting up a 10-story apartment building, and there is a cost to servicing, the extra water lines and electrical lines and street changes and so forth, and the developer is charged for those activities. The thinking is that that's being taken from his profits and is a downward pressure on his ability to bid up the price of land to purchase that property, given what he would, he's charging with the market, no matter what he does, and this applies to inclusionary zoning too. They're always going to charge what the market can bear, right? And this is a way of capturing some of that unearned income, some of that margin. And therefore, he can't afford to bid up the land as much. He or she can't afford to bid up the land as much, right?
Well, personally, I think it's a good idea to extract that kind of obligation from the developer, because it's something that somebody's going to have to pay, but it can't be at the expense of maybe a larger beneficial program like a land value tax, but it's something.
All right. So
it's just another version, really. It's a tax on the land. It's indirect, but it's a clever way of removing some of that unearned income, that economic rent, from the builder's equation.
Yeah,
So he knows he can't pay as much for the vacant or low density property, because some of what he thinks he can make based on what the market will bear is being passed on to the city.
it's just discrete rather than long-term, but
Perfect word.
Joe, if you have any references on that experiment, would be happy to share with our panelists. Maybe they can take a look.
Certainly.
Good. So we don't have any other questions, so I'm going to kindly ask our panelists to make some closing statements if they have, and then we'll call it a day. You want to go first? Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I'm happy to kind of be here. I didn't talk much about sort of Western Queens CLT and where we came from. And I think that was actually originally how I was invited, rather than sort of wearing my academic hat. But one thing I did want to, or two things I wanted to really reiterate. And the first is that CLTs are not just about the removal of the land from the market. But are also very much about sort of community democracy. it's different than, you could get a benevolent sort of philanthropist to buy up all the land, and you know, um, and remove it from the market, and it wouldn't make it a community land trust. It could be a land trust, right, where the land is out of the, but it wouldn't be a community land trust, right? And then it would be some version of, right, like what Ebenezer Howard was talking about, with the Garden City movement in England 120 years ago. But the community control is really important, and Hannah talked about it length, and I know that Min Kwan is very sort of accountable to its members. And the second thing that I did want to also reiterate is that because of that, land trusts aren't about housing. They're about community control over land. Very often what we do with them is housing. But our work at WQCLT, we were created, organizers that were part of the fight against Amazon. HQ2 in Long Island City decided that rather than continuing to wait for more sort of crappy sort of real estate capital and real estate developer-led plans, that we were going to put together our own plan and take over a building that is publicly owned but mostly unused, on Vernon and 44th in LIC, and turn it into a kind of mixed use CLT, partnering with a bunch of other kinds of community and other groups. So, Commissary Kitchen that we're doing with the Street Vendors Project, and the food co-op that we're doing with food justice organizers, performing arts space and not-for-profit space, and a whole bunch of other things that aren't about housing, but are about meeting a diverse set of community needs. And coming out of an 18-month visioning process with countless meetings, in person, outdoors, through the pandemic, and on Zoom through the pandemic as well, to kind of construct what the vision was going to be. And now our fight is to, is a site acquisition fight, right? Which is why the Public Land for Public Good bill is so important, that Hannah was talking about. And I'll stop with those two things.
Yes, Hannah?
Sure, I can go. I'm just gonna continue with what James is saying and just say that in order to really have democratic community control, you have to constantly organize. And so grassroots organizing is a huge piece of the work of community land trusts, and sometimes that's forgotten. But you have to do ongoing organizing. And our board is made up of residents of the neighborhood, residents who live on the land, and then we have some ally directors who have certain expertise and share the values. But we also have a membership that's made up of residents, and those residents elect our board. So it's really this highly localized democracy.
Thanks. Haley?
Speaking more to decommodifying housing in general, I think we do need politicians who are going to be out of the pockets of real estate if we're ever going to see any deep substantive change in terms of the way that real estate has a control over our city. And we need to get out of the pockets of big real estate developers. We need to focus on building social housing and building the capacity to build social housing and strengthen CLTs throughout the city if we want a more equitable New York City where people can afford to live.
Thanks. Dr. Mahdi?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. It was an excellent panel, and I think you did an excellent job. I think one thing that I want to leave with is the idea that success breeds success. And it sounds, from what I'm hearing from the panelists, that, for example, when Haley said that there's 2 new CLTs that happened within the last month, that's proof that somebody's doing something right. So I think we need to keep doing those kind of things, and we need to continue the outreach to the legislation to do, for example, the public bank and the ideas that Ed brought up. But I did want to address something that Michael from London had, well, he asked about subsidies. And, you know, this is a common refrain from conservatives saying that, well, somebody's got to dig deep in their pockets to provide some poor people some money because they can't afford, you know, this nonsense. There's something that's critical to the understanding of Henry George and his solution is that the price of land and the value of land are really two different things. You can have land have a zero value. Well, you could have land that has a zero price where, you know, zero price. But the value is very high. And that's the situation where you've taken the future rents and capitalize them. If you can't do that, then the price of land is going to be zero. Why would you hold land that you can't get the future rents? So whenever land has a price, that means that there's tons of money available to society to do the kind of things that we're all talking about. So never be dissuaded by going after this, something that's a public good because we don't have the money. Well, the money is there. The money's in the land. We just haven't returned and recycled it back to the agencies that can do the good work that we need done. So I just wanted to leave that because sometimes the Henry George message is not stated that well. So I think you did a great job. I think we should revisit this as we find in the future.
Thank you, Mary. Special thanks to all our panelists for making this happen. Many thanks to all of you who tuned in today, and we look forward to seeing you soon at the Henry George School.